Welcome to the London History Podcast. I'm Hazel Baker from londonguidedwalks.co.uk, bringing you the people, places and events that have shaped the city we see today. In this episode, we're going to one of London's most deceptively ordinary open spaces, Smithfield. Today it's a place of markets, lunch breaks and office shortcuts. For centuries though, this smooth field on the edge of the Square Mile was one of London's principal stages for public execution, where rebels, traitors and religious dissenters died in front of large crowds so that state and church could send very public messages about power, loyalty and belief. It was theatre. Not in the sort of theatre with velvet seats and an interval, but a carefully choreographed performance of pain, authority and sometimes martyrdom. In this episode, I'll walk you through what happened at Smithfield and why it mattered, and what remains on the ground today. I'll also be waving in comments from City of London tour guide Maria Alexe, whose background in performing arts and languages means she thinks a lot about London streets as a kind of stage. If you'd like more on the wider history of capital punishment in London, do go back to episode 92, Public Executions, where I talked to City of London tour guide Ian McDermott about how Londoners experience executions across the city. First up, where and what is Smithfield? Let's get our bearings first. When we say Smithfield, in this episode we're talking about West Smithfield, not East Smithfield near the Tower of London. It's the area around St Bart's Hospital and the Smithfield Meat Market, with the Church of St Bartholomew the Great tucked just to the northeast. This is in the northwest corner of the city, close to Farringdon. This has been an open, relatively flat space for centuries. In crowded London, that's always a clue. If it's not been built over, something important has kept it clear. In Smithfield's case, that something was a long history as both marketplace and execution ground. Before I became a guide, walking through, whenever you see an open space in London, there's a story there, because otherwise it'll be built on, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Smithfield has this mix of modern and old, but it's slightly more old than modern, I would say. And you can definitely feel that there's something lurking about, that there's some digging to be done there to discover some things. It's got an air of mystery about it still.
Smithfield has a long-standing role as a gathering place. Horse fairs, cattle markets, cloth and meat trading, and the Great Bartholomew Fair all brought large crowds here well before, during and after its theatre of execution phase. The fair itself is documented from the 12th century onwards, and by the 17th century it's notorious enough that the playwright Ben Jonson sets an entire satirical comedy here, simply called Bartholomew Fair. All noise, booths, showmen and pickpockets swirling around the same ground we're talking about. Because it was outside the city walls, but close enough to draw large crowds, Smithfield was ideal for public punishment. Authorities could gather people here for markets and fairs and then use the same open space when they wanted a spectacle that would be seen, talked about and remembered.
Smithfield did offer quite a lot of geographical advantages as far as an execution spot was concerned, until it didn't. As the city expanded, Tyburn became a better place for this kind of spectacle because it could accommodate more people, bigger crowds, whereas Smithfield had been, let's say, engulfed by the city, by London, essentially. But while it was a popular place for executions during those few centuries, it is the most famous for the burnings, particularly for what people call the Marian burnings, so the burnings of heretics, Protestants during the reign of Queen Mary I, Mary Tudor. Heretics and traitors were the ones that usually found themselves at Smithfield facing their death.
Considering really the location of Smithfield, because Tyburn's quite a fair old way, it would have been a huge space, you can fit more people in, but it does feel that Smithfield was used for executions of people that their executions needed to be seen, and they needed to be seen by certain people, and I suppose all those influential names would be living in the city at that time as well.
Absolutely. And it would have been situated very well for that kind of spectacle. It is a very easy walk from St. Paul's Cathedral, from Guildhall in the City of London. So accessible from many parts of the city, even from the Tower of London, where sometimes prisoners were held. If they were to have been marched from there to Smithfield, that would have been maybe depending on the pace, 20, 25-minute walk. They would have gathered enough crowds on the way. So that would definitely have ensured the presence of as many citizens as possible. Not to mention the fact that Smithfield, for perhaps longer than it had been used as a place for executions, had been used as a market and the place of a fair. You had the Bartholomew Fair, which held there regularly and attracted huge crowds.
So when does Smithfield's execution story begin, and who ends up dying here? The first clearly recorded execution at Smithfield is in 1305, when the Scottish rebel William Wallace is hanged, drawn and quartered. Contemporary chronicles place his death at Smithfield, the old name for Smithfield. The site may have been used for hangings earlier, but Wallace is one of the earliest securely attested cases. The last clearly documented burning on record is in 1612, when a Protestant is put to death for heresy here. After that, official attention shifts more firmly towards places like Tyburn, and for elite beheadings, Tower Hill. Some sources suggest hangings may have continued at Smithfield until the 18th century, but the evidence is patchy, so historians disagree. By the Tudor period, Smithfield has a distinct role in London's execution geography. Everyday thieves and pickpockets are more likely to find themselves at Tyburn, where hanging is the standard punishment for theft, smuggling, poaching, piracy, and so on. Smithfield becomes strongly associated with burnings for heresy and with high-profile traitors and political or religious opponents. It sits alongside rather than replaces other sites on this wider landscape of punishment. Across Mary I's reign, around 288 people are burned for heresy in England. About 48 of them die at Smithfield. Those numbers come from John Fawkes' huge martyrology, and while modern scholars may quibble over one or two cases, the overall scale is clear. The fire here is part of a national campaign. But the choice of Smithfield, with its proximity to St. Paul's Cathedral, Guildhall, Newgate and the Tower of London, give those deaths a particular political charge. One way we can get close to this world is through John Fawkes' Acts and Monuments, usually known as Fawkes' Book of Martyrs. First published in 1563 and expanded in later editions, it devotes hundreds of pages to Marian burnings, including many at Smithfield. Fawkes gathers official records, eyewitness accounts, letters and woodcut illustrations to build long narratives of individuals burned for their beliefs. He has an agenda. He is writing as a convinced Protestant and wants martyrs to be remembered. But he also preserves voices we would otherwise have forgot. For generations, families read his stories at home, much like a grim alternative to the family Bible. So his version of events shaped English memory of this period.
It is really scary to think about. I have to say, some of the accounts that were left to us by John Fawkes, who wrote some contemporary descriptions of the Marian burnings, they are quite haunting. One of the ones that stood out for me, this might seem a little bit strange. It's not particularly horrific, but it's the vivid description of what the day looked like for the man in question that really touched me. So the man's name is John Rogers. He was the first one to be burnt at the stake during the reign of Queen Mary. This was in 1555, and he is imprisoned in Newgate prison, which is again a very convenient short walk from Smithfield. And apparently in the morning, it took a lot of shaking to wake him up. I don't know why this detail haunts me because can you imagine? You've been trying to eat probably right. It's been a difficult one. And then you get those sweet hours in the morning when you finally fall asleep and you sleep so deeply. And then someone's shaking you awake saying it's time to be burnt alive. Again, it's by far not the most horrific detail that I've read, but it really stuck with me.
The imprisoned John Rogers at Newgate asks to see his wife one last time and is refused. A small, brutal decision that tells us a lot about how tightly controlled this performance is meant to be. Fawkes has him going to the stake, praying for his accusers and refusing to recant, even lifting his hands towards heaven as far as his chains will allow. We have to allow for Fawkes's bias in the way he tells it, but we can see why scenes like this have helped to turn executed heretics into enduring martyrs. Another figure whose story has resonated for centuries is Anne Askew, a young woman from Lincolnshire who reads the Bible for herself, shares it aloud, and refuses to give the answers her interrogators want. Uniquely, some of her own examinations were written up and circulated, so we hear her voice more directly than we do for most people in her position.
We can't really mention Smithfield and not mention Anne Askew. She was burned alive. She was a Protestant martyr, a Protestant woman, as the name describes. And again, she fell foul of King Henry VIII, who, again, was feeling quite threatened by Protestants who read the Bible for themselves, interpreted it in their own way, which is exactly what Anne did. She was married pretty much against her will, but as she was a dutiful daughter, she went ahead with it at age 15 to a man who was a fervent Catholic. But she found comfort in reading the Bible. She was a fervent reader of the Bible, and she found her calling in reading it out loud to anyone who would listen, including publicly. This was something that women were not allowed to do at the time. And it wasn't long before she got in trouble with the authorities, not least because by now she was seeking a divorce from her husband. So you would add that to her independent ways, that she wanted to leave her husband, which was obviously considered improper of her. She was rumored to have been quite close to people who knew the Queen very well, who were friends with the Queen. By Queen, right now, we mean Queen Catherine Parr, the sixth wife of Henry VIII, who was also a Protestant herself. So for all these reasons, she got in trouble with the authorities to the extent where she was tortured. She was put on the rack in the Tower of London because she would not give up information. She basically didn't want to get other people in trouble, and she never did, as a result of which she ended up being carried to her place of execution, Smithfield, of course, sat in a chair on a cart because she was unable to walk, she was unable to stand, and this is the condition in which she went to her death. According to a contemporary description, she went to her death with a kind of peaceful smile on her face. Again, we don't know that for sure, but she seemed to have made her peace with what was happening to her. Although, if you read some of her own accounts of her interviews, she didn't necessarily want to be a martyr. In fact, she avoided answering the questions of various learned men who interviewed her in the most shrewd of ways. So she was clearly a very clever woman. But obviously, there was only so long she could withstand the assault on her beliefs and on her person, and she became a Smithfield martyr as well.
I think the easiest way of describing Anne Askew is that they could break her body but not her spirit.
Yes, it sounds like it was exactly like that until the very end.
Anne doesn't seem to have sought martyrdom. Her recorded examinations show a clever, cautious woman trying to incriminate others. But the combination of torture, public burning, and then publication in Fawkes' book makes her one of Smithfield's defining Protestant martyrs. Executions at Smithfield use several different methods, each carrying its own message. The most familiar is hanging. The convicted person stands on a ladder or in a cart, a noose is put over the neck and the support is removed. If the drop is long and the angle right, the neck breaks. More often in the medieval and early Tudor period, they slowly suffocate. The more modern long drop, designed to break the neck cleanly, belongs to a later reforming age. For heresy, the standard punishment is burning at the stake. The condemned is tied to a post on a pile of faggots, which are bundles of wood and kindling. How long they suffer depends on wind, fuel and smoke. In some cases, smoke inhalation kills relatively quickly. In others, damp wood or awkward wind keeps them alive longer. Accounts from the period talk about fires ill-kindled or ill-ordered, taking far longer than anyone wished.
There are even accounts of, I think this was two Protestants during the Marian burnings, if I'm not mistaken, but they were friends and they were executed together and they were tied to the stake back to back. And one of them died long before the other one did because of the way the wind was blowing. The other one had to just suffer there alive, being burned, while his companion was already dead. It's just, yeah, it's awful to imagine. Now, in terms of how quick it would take for someone to die, this also depended very much on the amount of smoke they would inhale. If they were really lucky, they would die by smoke inhalation fairly quickly. We must keep in mind the fact that the fire would be burning underneath them, so they would be standing up on this kind of pile of, they were called faggots. They were bunches of wood, dry wood, and other kind of kindling. So if conditions were propitious, they would just inhale smoke and die. But anyway, people were there watching this spectacle with shock, with grief, with delight, if they thought the person deserved it, and perhaps with the fear of death struck in them if they had anything in common with the convicted person. I'm thinking, of course, of beliefs in particular.
Modern medical understanding suggests that once the outer layers of skin and their nerve endings are destroyed, the capacity to feel pain in that area is lost. It's a very small theoretical comfort because the minutes before that point would have been hideous. For high treason, men face the full ritual of being hanged, drawn and quartered.
According to some sources, it had been in use for a while as a hanging place by the time one of the most notorious executions happened there in 1305. And that was none other than William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter, let's say.
William Wallace's death at Smithfield in 1305 is the classic example. That grisly sequence isn't unique to Wallace. It's the formal penalty for high treason in English law right into the 19th century, although in later centuries much of it is carried out after death or commuted altogether. The distribution of heads and quarters to different towns is meant to turn a single execution into a kingdom-wide warning. As if that wasn't enough, Smithfield also witnesses one of the most shocking punishments in Tudor England: boiling alive.
When we make jokes about how violent the medieval times were, we sometimes say, oh yeah, you'd get boiled to death just because you said something. And while it wasn't quite like that, I'm afraid boiling people alive was a method of execution. And it wasn't even that long ago, I would say. There's a record of a man by the name of Richard Rouse who was boiled alive in Smithfield in the year 1531, which to me is particularly shocking because 1531, it's not the Dark Ages. I know we're not supposed to say the Dark Ages anymore, but people know what you mean when you say that.
Renaissance, the age of enlightenment.
Yes. Science is starting to poke its head out and look around to see what's what. art is flourishing, has been flourishing, like you said, for centuries now in Europe. People are navigating, they're starting to travel the world. This really is a time that we could definitely call of civilization. And yet, during the reign of Henry VIII, a man was boiled alive, at least one that we know of. This was a punishment which was reserved for usually poisoners. Although I read in some other sources that it was also reserved for people who forged coins for some reason. Can you imagine? And so poisoning was considered, trying to poison someone was considered a particularly heinous and cowardly way of murdering or trying to murder someone. And this unfortunate man, Richard Rouse, he was a cook and he worked for the Bishop of Rochester. He cooked a meal as a result of which lots of people in the household, not the bishop because he didn't eat it, became ill and 2 people died. We don't know whether his intention was to poison anyone. He denied it. This may have just been an unfortunate case of extreme, severe food poisoning. We don't know, but what we do know is that the appropriate punishment for him was considered to be boiled alive. So this consisted of the convicted being immersed repeatedly in a cauldron of, in Richard Rouse's case, boiling water, although there are accounts of other liquids being used, such as oil or tar. In this case, it was water, and he was placed in a gibbet and immersed repeatedly in water until he died. Apparently, in Richard Rouse's case, this lasted about a couple of hours, which is awful. I'm assuming this was done because if it's boiling water, you might drown before you boil. So obviously that defeats the purpose. You have to die in horrific pain. People were sickened by this one. Even people in 1531 thought this was a bit much. So people got sick, quite literally, witnessing the execution. People fainted and were just horrified. And you would be. Of course.
Also, watching someone suffer for 2 hours, I mean, who's got the stomach for that? I do remember when I was reading how people were actually quite bored by it because it's not a dramatic thing. Because he's seeing, you know, in the iron gibbet there, he goes down, dunking into this cauldron of boiling water, and then being pulled up again. He would have been not even boiled alive in a way, because then you're cooling him when he comes out to then be dipped again. It just sounds absolutely horrendous. Boiling is introduced by statute under Henry VIII, specifically for poisoners. Rouse's execution at Smithfield becomes notorious. Reports talk about him being immersed repeatedly in a cauldron of boiling water for a prolonged period, long enough that witnesses faint and are physically sick. One other known case here involves a woman, Margaret Davy, boiled after poisoning her employer's household. By 1547, after Henry VIII's death, the law permitting boiling is repealed. A small sign that even in the 16th century, there are limits to what contemporaries consider acceptable. There may have also been at least one trial by combat here, a legal duel to settle an accusation of treason. Though the evidence is messy and the one detailed example ends not with a clean kill, but with a fighter collapsing from exhaustion. Trial by combat is a recognised medieval legal procedure, but in practice it is rare and fading out by the 15th century. What would you experience if you turned up at Smithfield on an execution day? Authorities stage the whole thing as a procession and performance.
I don't want to make it sound banal, or I don't want to be disrespectful about the fact that this was essentially people being killed, but it would have been almost a bit like some kind of sports event or music festival for some, at least. I'm not trying to say that this was the only entertainment that people had. Of course, it's not. They were special occasions. Public executions didn't happen quite every day. But wherever there are crowds gathered to watch something, that atmosphere creates itself. People, all sorts of opportunists would have been present. Pickpockets, anyone who was selling something that they thought they might have a chance to sell at that particular occasion. People selling food, of course, vendors of different things, because why wouldn't you want a snack with your execution, especially if it's going to take 2 hours for the person to boil alive? You get hungry. Pubs would have been open. People would have gone in for pints. Some people who had a particularly horrible morbid curiosity, or maybe who were happy to see the person go to their death, would have paid a special price to watch the execution from good vantage points, from buildings around, from houses, from rooftops. So there was quite a lot of money to be made, really, by anyone who could speculate this kind of occasion. Then the prisoner, the convicted person, would be taken to their place of execution. This, depending on the distance, could take quite a while. They would either be made to walk or put in a cart and carried through the city towards the place of execution. This was another occasion to draw crowds, in case anyone wasn't aware of what was going on. Now, on the way, depending on the situation, depending on the political ethos at the time, depending on the popularity or lack thereof of the convicted person, they could be anything from booed and thrown things at to cheered and greeted like a hero. It really depends on each individual case. At their place of execution, usually they would get the chance to speak, share any last thoughts that they might have, which some people refused. Some people took advantage of to recant or to ask for forgiveness from God, to confess, sometimes even to confess to other crimes, to put their mind at ease, or to speak ill against their accusers and to profess their innocence. It could have been anything. Some people managed to work the crowd, gain sympathy. Perhaps it made them feel good. Some people achieved quite the opposite effect. Again, it really depended on their situation.
At Smithfield, the space is ringed with people, those on the ground, street sellers and pickpockets working the crowd. Alehouses and upper windows rented out as premium seating. Diaries and court records from London and other cities describe people paying for a window or climbing onto roofs to get a better view. At the scaffold or stake, the condemned is usually allowed to speak, to confess, to recant, to proclaim innocence, or to defend their beliefs. Printers often publish these last dying speeches as cheap pamphlets, so we know a surprising amount about what was said. Some people use that moment to work the crowd, others alienate them. In the case of religious martyrs, those final words can be as important as the manner of death. Reactions in the crowd range from horror and grief to genuine delight that an enemy is being punished. And crucially, the authorities run a risk. In trying to terrify spectators into obedience, they sometimes create heroes, especially when strong beliefs and powerful stories meet a sympathetic audience. These punishments are engineered to do more than kill. They're meant to deter treason and heresy by putting fear into everyone watching and by making examples that live on in memory. We can see all the workaround contemporaries know about: sanctuary in churches for a limited period, benefit of clergy for those who can claim it, pregnancy pleas for women, escape from prison, fleeing abroad. Legal records are full of people trying every possible route to avoid the gallows or the stake. And over the very long term, England formally abolishes the death penalty in the 20th century. While reconstructed, murder rates are far lower today than in the Middle Ages. If we judge by statistics and by the persistence of dissent, spectacular punishment looks less like an effective deterrent and more like a brutal tool of messaging that sometimes backfires. We've talked a lot about the suffering, some of the political and religious motives on either side, but ultimately these punishments were designed to put fear into everybody watching. Now, from your reading, do you think the public executions, especially at Smithfield, actually worked?
In a nutshell, this is my own personal opinion. No, I don't think that these punishments had the desired effect to the extent that authorities hoped they would. Especially if you're dealing with people who, as I mentioned earlier, have this fervent belief that they're on the side of God and that they are headed for the afterlife where everything will be okay. Because if you think you're condemning your immortal soul to eternal damnation by recanting your beliefs, you're not going to recant your beliefs. No, I don't think so. I'm sure they deterred some people from speaking publicly of their beliefs. I know I definitely would have considered signing whatever they wanted me to sign. So I'm sure some people did not act upon their beliefs openly. But ultimately, of course, this is a broader discussion about the capital punishment. Does it work? Does it not work? If we simply look at crime statistics, broadening it a little bit to other crimes, it just doesn't look like they acted as a deterrent. Crime just continued to happen. Murder continued to happen. Shockingly, one of the murder capitals of Britain in medieval times was Oxford, where I suppose because of the concentration of young men and alcohol, etc., the murder rate actually was a few dozens of times higher than in other cities such as London and York. And for me, this just shows that even people who were educated, so people who knew what was going on, I'm sure they were aware of the legal system and what punishment this kind of act carried. They still went ahead and did it. So it seems that no, it did not act as a deterrent. Things went on as they did.
I suppose if you're thinking that the authorities are using these as demonstrations of authority, then you could say that worked maybe, but they also ran the risk of undermining their own message by creating heroes and martyrs.
In many cases, they did. And not to mention the fact that there were ways of escaping punishment. So I suppose if you were really dead set on committing a crime that carried the death penalty at the back of your head, because this is human nature, you would think, oh, it's okay because maybe I can run away, or it's okay because maybe I can kill all the witnesses, or I'm going to, if you were a woman, I'm going to get pregnant or tell them that I'm pregnant, and usually they might have let you off. Or I'm going to take shelter in a church because you could do that for 40 days and then I'll flee the country somehow. So there were ways, or I'll just escape prison because obviously it wasn't like today. So with all that, keeping all that in mind, I do think that they didn't act as a deterrent, nowhere to the extent that the authorities would have hoped that they would. And if the death penalty did get abolished in Britain and the crime rate, of course, bearing in mind that statistics and reports were not as accurate as they are today, but the crime rate, the murder rate at least, has definitely dropped significantly since the medieval times or the Tudor times or even later on. So by that alone, I would say, no, they didn't really work.
So if we stand in Smithfield now, perhaps at the end of our Bleeding Hearts and Body Parts walking tour, or our Heretics and Horrors walking tour, what kind of traces of this story can you still find? You have Smithfield Market, a site of meat trading for almost 1,000 years, even though the current market buildings are 19th century. You have St. Bartholomew's Hospital, founded in the 12th century and still operating on the same site. You can still walk under the Gothic gateway that was once marked the entrance to the Priory Church of St. Bartholomew. Later, a timber-framed Tudor house is planted right on top of it, a wonderfully blunt visual statement of the new regime sitting on top of the old. Step through that gateway and you reach St. Bartholomew the Great, one of the oldest surviving parish churches in London, with substantial Norman stonework that would have been familiar to many who witnessed the executions. Street names whispered the older stories too. Cloth Fair remembers the cloth market that was part of Bartholomew Fair. Merchants lodged and traded here during fair time, and some of those medieval property lines still shape the streets today. A short walk away at Pie Corner, a small gilded buoy marks the supposed spot where the Great Fire of London finally burned out. Another little figure on a wall loaded with moralising stories about sin and punishment. When I bring groups today, what strikes many of them is the contrast. We pause for a coffee or nip to the hospital or scan for a blood test just yards from where crowds once watched neighbours and strangers put to death. Today, Smithfield is a place to cut through on your lunch break or have a drink or visit a hospital or join a guided walk rather than watch an execution. But if you know where to look and what to imagine, it remains one of London's most revealing places to think about justice, memory, belief, and the stories the city chooses to tell about itself. So if you'd like to explore more of this history on the ground, then join me or Maria or one of our colleagues on our Bleeding Hearts and Body Parts walking tour, which finishes in the Smithfield area. It's also available as a private tour for groups. You'll find all the details at londonguidedwalks.co.uk, along with show notes and links to some of the sources mentioned in this episode. Thanks for listening to the London History Podcast. I'm Hazel Baker. Until next time.